Item: SCP-957. Object Class: Keter. Special Containment Procedures: SCP-957 is to be monitored via remote video surveillance set up within the location where it currently resides. Personnel are allowed to approach and interview the entity when given clearance by 4 Level 3 or higher employees. 1. D-Class subject is to inhabit the closest residence to SCP-957's location as possible in order to minimize civilian exposure to the entity. SCP-957's house is to be monitored for signs of SCP-957-1 exhibiting unusual behavior, namely feigning helplessness due to blindness. If this is observed, a D-Class subject is to be sent to escort SCP-957-1 back into its house. Description: SCP-957 is a humanoid entity currently residing within a house in Kentucky. This organism measures approximately 2 meters in height and 75 kilograms in weight and appears to be devoid of internal organs, as observed via a large opening on its ventral torso. Furthermore, it does not appear to require sleep or nourishment. Interaction with personnel has shown that the entity is capable of speech and is fluent in English, but prefers to talk in a currently unknown language. It is not openly hostile towards Foundation personnel, yet often refuses to cooperate with interviews and testing. Attempts to restrain SCP-957 for these purposes have proven ineffective due to the entity's disproportionate level of strength. SCP-957 will always reside in a house inhabited by a single human, hereby designated SCP-957-1. When the instance of SCP-957-1 that SCP-957 is living with dies, the entity will demanifest from the location and reappear in the nearest location that fits the above-mentioned requirements. Upon doing this, it will seek out the individual residing there and force the human's body through an apparent portal via its chest cavity, where the subject will remain for approximately 4 hours before emerging. After this, SCP-957-1 will be missing its eyes as well as exhibiting drastic changes to its memory. These individuals will believe that they have been blind all of their life and possess knowledge of Braille and living without sight. Additionally, they will believe that SCP-957 is a close family member, a dear friend, or a partner in an intimate relationship that had been severely burned all over its body. As such, they show affection for the entity but refuse to touch it. Once every month, SCP-957-1 will go into crowded areas and feign distress due to its blindness. It appears to do this in order to deceive people into helping it back to its house. Once SCP-957-1 has successfully lured a human subject into the building, it will lock the doors, shout, walk to the dining room and sit down until SCP-957 addresses it after dealing with the human. At this point, SCP-957 will approach the human, and a black spherical barrier will surround the two subjects. This obstruction is composed of an unknown substance and is apparently impenetrable. This structure usually remains in place for approximately 5 hours. However, it has been noted to demanifest as early as 30 minutes after manifestation and as late as 27 hours after manifestation. The human normally appears to have undergone extreme physical alteration during this time too. In 30% of observed cases, the human is reduced to piles of organs seemingly organized by their respective biological system. SCP-957 usually then uses these remains to prepare a meal for SCP-957-1. The other 70% are taken to the fireplace of the house and burned.